Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Victor Newman's departure from the Young and the Restless in October following his shocking cancer diagnosis was not just a storyline shift, it was the kind of earth-shattering turning point that left Genoa city trembling and fans across the globe utterly stunned. Because for decades Victor has been the immovable force, the iron-willed titan who crushed enemies, defended his empire, and controlled the fates of everyone around him with a blend of ruthless cunning and heartfelt devotion to the family he always proclaimed was the center of his universe, even if his way of showing love was more often through manipulation and control than through gentle words or quiet compassion. And so when whispers first began that Victor was experiencing unexplained fatigue, missed a few high-powered meetings, and quietly retreated from the forefront of Newman Enterprises, many brushed it off as a temporary hiccup, perhaps even another one of his elaborate ruses to test loyalty or flush out betrayal. But then came the harrowing confirmation: Victor, the so-called Moustache, the man who has outwitted death countless times, was now facing a battle against cancer, a disease that could not be negotiated with, intimidated, or bought off with billions. And that reality broke through the illusion of invincibility that had always surrounded him, leaving his children, Victoria, Nick, Adam, Abby, and his devoted wife Nikki grappling with a mixture of fear, heartbreak, and the kind of anger that often arises when the seemingly untouchable are suddenly rendered fragile. And as news spread through Genoa city, the reactions came swift and layered, with Jack Abbott, Victor's lifelong nemesis and occasional ally, blindsided by a cocktail of sorrow and reluctant respect, because for all their decades of rivalry, Jack understood better than anyone that Victor was the kind of adversary who defined you, shaped you, gave you a purpose to fight, and so even Jack could not help but feel that the thought of a world without Victor Newman left an unfillable void, while others like Phyllis, Sharon, and even schemers on the periphery of his orbit were forced to reflect on just how deeply Victor's presence, whether as friend, foe, or patriarchal shadow, had influenced every corner of Genoa city. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching reaction came from Nikki, who has stood by Victor through affairs, betrayals, boardroom wars, and near-death escapes, yet who now found herself staring at the one battle she could not simply will him through, the one enemy too insidious for even Victor's legendary resilience. And as October unfolded, the narrative took on a solemn, almost elegiac tone, with Victor making the heartbreaking decision to step away from Newman Enterprises, a company that was as much his identity as his empire, and entrust its future to the very children whose loyalty he has tested, doubted, and fractured over the years. And this passing of the torch was anything but smooth, with Victoria demanding recognition for her decades of sacrifice and strategic brilliance, Adam pushing for the chance to finally be acknowledged as worthy, Nick torn between family duty and his desire for independence, and Abby quietly struggling to be seen as more than an afterthought. And in his departure, Victor forced them all to confront not only their ambitions but also their unresolved resentments toward a father who was both their greatest champion and their harshest critic. And as Victor prepared to leave Genoa city, perhaps not forever, but for an indefinite time of treatment and recovery, the atmosphere was thick with both sorrow and unease, because when a man like Victor Newman steps away, the vacuum he leaves behind is not one that can be filled by a single successor or rival, but rather it destabilizes the entire balance of power, and already whispers of hostile takeovers, opportunistic plots, and family implosions began to circulate, while at the same time, on a more human level, the emotional weight of saying goodbye, even temporarily, to Victor was profound, with scenes that brought fans to tears as he held Nikki close and promised her that his fight was not over, as he told Victoria that she was the rightful heir yet must earn her siblings' respect, as he assured Nick that his decency and moral compass were the qualities that truly made him proud, as he gave Adam a rare moment of affirmation that he had always been his son despite their countless battles, and as he reminded Abby that her compassion was her strength, all culminating in an unforgettable farewell in October where the Moustache, the legend, the empire builder, walked away not in defeat, but in dignity, declaring that though cancer had forced him to step back, it had not broken him, and that his spirit, his legacy, and his love for his family would endure. And so Victor Newman's exit was not just another plot twist, it was a seismic shift, a sobering reminder of mortality in a world where characters so often seem immortal, and a narrative choice that honored Braeden's portrayal while also setting the stage for the next generation of Newmans to rise, falter, clash, and perhaps one day prove themselves worthy of the empire that Victor built, and whether fans believe he will return stronger than ever or fear that this is the beginning of the end. The October moment when Victor Newman left The Young and the Restless after being diagnosed with cancer will forever stand as one of the most poignant, powerful, and unforgettable chapters in the soap's storied history, a turning point where the man who always believed he could bend fate to his will was finally forced to confront the one truth no amount of power can erase, that even the greatest must one day face their own mortality, and in that moment, audiences around the world were reminded why Victor Newman is, and always will be, the heart and soul of Genoa City. Victor Newman's cancer diagnosis and subsequent departure from The Young and the Restless in October wasn't just the storyline of the season, it was a tectonic shift that reverberated through every corner of Genoa City, shaking the foundations of families, businesses, and relationships that had, for decades, been defined in reaction to Victor's enormous shadow. And to truly grasp the gravity of this moment, one must rewind through the countless chapters of his saga, because Victor Newman was never merely a character, he was an institution, a titan who had risen from a tragic childhood in an orphanage to become one of the most formidable and polarizing figures daytime television has ever seen, and every victory, betrayal, love affair, and scheme seemed to build upon this mythology of invincibility, so when the cancer storyline emerged, it wasn't just another plot twist, it was a crack in the armor of a man who had built his life on the premise that he could control and conquer anything, and that juxtaposition made the October exit both heartbreaking and strangely cathartic, as if fate itself was demanding that even Victor must bow to the truths of human fragility. For Nikki Newman, this diagnosis carried a torment unlike any she had faced before, and that is saying something, because she has weathered his affairs, his manipulations, his faked deaths, and his ruthless business wars, yet in all those crises, she could at least fight alongside him or against him, but cancer was a foe that she could not seduce, outwit, or banish with an ultimatum, and the quiet terror of possibly losing the love of her life made her scenes all the more wrenching, because Nikki is a woman of strength and elegance, but she is also someone whose heart has always been tethered to Victor's, no matter the cost, and the prospect of facing a world without him was something she dared not imagine. So when Victor told her he needed to step away from Newman Enterprises to focus on his health, Nikki's tears weren't just of sadness but of awe, because this was Victor Newman, the man who would never relinquish control, finally admitting he needed to fight a battle on different terms, and in that moment, Nikki became his rock, promising to stand by him through every treatment, every sleepless night, every fear-filled silence, and that vow gave viewers one of the most poignant testaments of enduring love the show has ever portrayed. Victoria Newman's reaction, of course, was tangled in layers of ambition, pride, resentment, and grief, because for years she has been the most loyal of Victor's children, sacrificing her own happiness to prove herself in the corporate arena, and though she has often clashed with her father over his controlling ways, deep down every boardroom triumph was about earning his respect, and now, when he told her he was leaving the reins of Newman Enterprises largely in her hands, she should have felt triumphant. Yet instead she felt the crushing weight of responsibility coupled with the fear of losing the very man she has strived to emulate, and her private tears revealed the little girl within her who still longed for her father's approval, who still dreaded his disappointment, and now she faced the unbearable thought that she might never again hear him bark her name in disapproval or tell her with rare tenderness that she made him proud, and so Victoria's storyline became not only about leadership but also about mourning the looming loss of a father who defined her. Nick Newman, ever the moral compass of the family, struggled in his own way, because though he had often distanced himself from Newman Enterprises in pursuit of a simpler life, the cancer diagnosis drew him back in, and for Nick the heartbreak wasn't about boardroom battles but about family dinners, about the legacy of love and strength he wanted to pass to his own children, and about the realization that his father, the man who had often been too hard, too exacting, was suddenly vulnerable in a way Nick had never seen before, and his desire to protect, to nurture, to carry some of that burden was palpable, but at the same time, Nick wrestled with anger that Victor had always prioritized power over health, anger that life had chosen now to remind them of mortality, and anger that he would once again have to step into a role he wasn't sure he wanted, because no matter how far Nick strays, He always gets pulled back into the Newman orbit, and this time the pull was not about business but about love, duty, and fear. Adam Newman's reaction, perhaps the most complex of all, was a roller coaster of bitterness, longing, and redemption, because Adam's entire life has been about struggling to gain recognition from Victor, the father who simultaneously embraced and rejected him, and now, when Victor was leaving, Adam was terrified that he might never truly earn the validation he craved, so his immediate response was defensive, even hostile, demanding his place in the Newman empire, pushing for the seat at the table he has always believed he deserved, but beneath that bravado was the terrified son who feared he might lose his father without ever fully reconciling their tumultuous relationship, and when Victor, in an uncharacteristically vulnerable moment, looked Adam in the eyes and told him he was his son, always had been, always would be, and that no business triumph could ever change that, it was a moment of healing that decades of schemes and betrayals had failed to bring, and for Adam, that single affirmation might have been more valuable than the entire Newman fortune, because it was the proof he had long sought that he was more than just Victor's afterthought. And then there was Abby, often the overlooked Newman, who quietly carried her own grief in a way that resonated deeply with fans who have long wished she would be given more prominence, because Abby's love for her father was uncomplicated by corporate ambition. She wanted his presence, his laughter, his support, and the idea of losing that devastated her in a pure, childlike way, reminding everyone that beneath all the money and power, Victor's greatest legacy was the family he created. Fractured as it may be, and Abby's whispered words about wishing he could be there to see her son grow up, to guide her through motherhood, were among the most touching admissions of the entire arc, grounding the storyline in the simple human truth that what we fear most when faced with mortality is not the loss of empires but the loss of moments, of milestones, of love shared and memories made. Outside the Newman family, the ripples of Victor's diagnosis and departure were seismic as well, and none felt it more profoundly than Jack Abbott, because though he and Victor have been locked in one of the most legendary rivalries in soap opera history, the news stripped away the layers of hostility and revealed the raw truth. Victor was Jack's greatest opponent, yes, but also the man who gave his own life meaning, who kept him sharp, who challenged him to rise and fall and rise again, and the prospect of a world where Victor was no longer there to battle was almost unthinkable, and Jack's private moment of reflection, glass of scotch in hand, tears brimming, was a masterclass in storytelling, because it acknowledged that sometimes our enemies are also our mirrors, and without them, we are left incomplete. Phyllis Summers, Sharon Rosales, and countless others also processed the news in their own ways, each remembering times when Victor's interference had changed their lives, for better or worse, and even those who had despised him could not deny that Genoa City without Victor Newman was like a stage missing its spotlight, and so the October episodes were drenched in nostalgia, flashbacks to his greatest triumphs, his most ruthless takedowns, his tenderest moments of love with Nikki, his fatherly advice, sometimes harsh, sometimes kind, and his countless declarations that Newman Enterprises was not just a business but a dynasty that must endure. And then came the farewell, the moment that fans will never forget, when Victor gathered his family at the ranch, the very heart of the Newman legacy, and spoke to them not as a mogul but as a father, a husband, a man staring down his mortality, and his words were filled with both fire and vulnerability, urging his children to stop fighting each other and instead fight for the family, reminding Nikki that she was his heart, telling Victoria she was strong enough to lead, assuring Nick that compassion was as powerful as ambition, embracing Adam as his son without condition, and promising Abby that she would always have his love, and as the camera lingered on his face, etched with both strength and weariness, it became clear that this was not just an exit, it was a passing of the torch, a demand that those left behind rise to the occasion, because Victor Newman may have been stepping away, but his legacy would remain woven into every breath Genoa City took. And so, as October closed and Victor left to begin treatment, fans were left grappling with the enormity of it all, with the shock of seeing the seemingly immortal Moustache forced to confront his own vulnerability, and with the anticipation of what this meant for the Newman family, for Newman Enterprises, and for Genoa City itself, because in his absence, the sharks would circle, rivalries would intensify, and the true measure of his children would be tested, but beyond all that, the storyline resonated because it spoke to a universal truth, that no matter how powerful, how rich, how untouchable we seem, we are all human, we are all fragile, and at the end of the day, what matters most is love, family, and the legacy we leave behind, and for Victor Newman, that legacy is indelible, eternal, and unforgettable. Victor Newman's decision to leave Genoa City in October after his cancer diagnosis was not only a personal tragedy for the Newman family but also an existential crisis for the world of the young and the restless, because Victor wasn't just another citizen of the fictional town, he was the anchor around which power, love, rivalry, and drama orbited, and without his presence, the entire landscape seemed unstable, as though the ground beneath everyone's feet had begun to tremble, and part of what made this exit so monumental was how it forced both the characters and the audience to look back at the incredible journey that had defined Victor's reign, from the moment he first strode into Genoa City decades ago, a self-made man whose ruthlessness in business was matched only by his passion for family, to the countless times he proved that no scheme was too dangerous, no betrayal too deep, and no obstacle too insurmountable for him to crush beneath the weight of his willpower. In the wake of his diagnosis, the show leaned heavily on flashbacks, weaving through some of Victor's most iconic moments, and fans were treated to an emotional retrospective that underscored just how deeply he had shaped every life around him. There were the early days of his marriage to Nikki, when he first fell for the beautiful stripper who would become his soulmate, a relationship marked by fiery passion, devastating betrayals, and a bond that survived infidelity, addiction, and even death itself. There was his cutthroat rise at Newman Enterprises, where his boardroom takedowns became the stuff of legend, from the hostile takeovers of rival companies to his brutal battles with Jack Abbott for control of Jabot, each skirmish etched into the DNA of Genoa City history. There were his tender moments with his children, sometimes rare, sometimes fleeting, but always powerful, such as teaching Victoria about strength, reminding Nick about integrity, giving Adam flashes of paternal recognition, and embracing Abby as a symbol of his legacy carried forward. And of course, there were the darker times, the moments when Victor's manipulations went too far, when he used people as pawns in his elaborate chess games, leaving scars that his family and rivals would never fully forget, and all of these pieces came rushing back in October, giving weight to the reality that the man who had lived such a larger-than-life existence was now facing something even he could not master. As Victor stepped away, each Newman child's journey expanded in ways that highlighted the complexity of his absence. Victoria, for all her determination, found herself haunted by doubts. Could she truly embody his ruthless instinct without becoming cold and joyless? Could she protect Newman Enterprises from opportunistic predators circling like sharks now that Victor was gone? And most importantly, could she keep the family united, or would old rivalries with her siblings tear apart everything their father had built? Nick, meanwhile, was thrust once again into the uncomfortable position of mediator, the peacemaker who wanted to honor his father but who also bristled at the endless tug-of-war between loyalty to the company and his desire for independence, and his quiet anguish as he tried to be strong for both his siblings and his own children gave viewers some of the most heartfelt, grounded moments of the storyline. Adam's arc, however, may have been the most explosive, because while he finally received the affirmation from Victor that he had always craved, that very recognition ignited a fire within him. Now that his father had acknowledged him, Adam became more determined than ever to prove himself worthy, yet his methods remained risky, volatile, and controversial, creating new conflicts with Victoria and Nick that seemed poised to rip the family apart. Abby, on the other hand, continued to represent the softer, more vulnerable side of the Newman legacy, reminding everyone that Victor was not just a CEO or a patriarch but a father and grandfather whose presence meant security, guidance, and love, and her insistence on keeping the family grounded in humanity, not just power, became an essential voice as the family reeled. But beyond the Newmans, Genoa City itself felt the shockwaves. Rivals who had spent years plotting against Victor suddenly found themselves staring at a world without their greatest adversary, and for some, this was liberating, while for others, it was disorienting. Jack Abbott, for instance, was left adrift, because while he could now theoretically move against Newman Enterprises without fear of Victor's immediate reprisal, the victory seemed hollow. What was Jabot's success worth without Victor to measure himself against? His reflections on their decades-long war, filled with venom, sabotage, and occasional, uneasy alliances, highlighted that sometimes our enemies define us more than our allies, and in losing Victor, Jack was losing a part of himself.